All right. Our next speaker is Tom Graves. And Tom, Tom is the professor emeritus from the Baptist Seminary of Richmond, a new PhD, and for most importantly, Tom, if you're Southern Baptist or no Southern Baptist, Tom and I in high school used to go down to a mission church in Louisville, Kentucky, and do training union on Sunday nights for an small inner city church. So he was one of my high school buddies and church buddies from a long time ago in Louisville, Kentucky, and we've partially kept in touch over the years, but have gotten, since my mother lives in Richmond and Tom lives in Richmond, we've really been able to reconnect in the last few years. And so it's just my delight to introduce a person who's not only led seminaries but also been responsible for helping the Association of Theological Schools to develop its policy on disability, but is also a really good friend. Sorry.
Thank you. I don't have a grip, so that would work for about 3 minutes. Can you hear me now? Well, now you know why I'm really here. I'm a boyhood friend of Bill's. And let me make one slight change. I am a former Southern Baptist. I want to talk to you today about the advantages of disadvantage. And I come to speak from an intensely personal role. This is not so much a spectator view of issues of disability and spirituality as it is a view from the inside. So let me talk to you very personally in terms of my own personal faith commitments of a Christian standpoint, and speaking as well from my own personal standpoint of disability as a person struggling with multiple sclerosis. In addressing the topic of learning from adversity, let me begin with two basic understandings. First, what I have to say speaks to more than just my personal experience of living with multiple sclerosis, for we all share disadvantages of failure, grief, sorrow, sickness, and frustration. Living with limitations is a universal human experience. Second, though I will speak of spiritual lessons learned, I do not want in any way to identify God as the source of evil that comes upon us. God does not send pain our way so that we may gain something from our difficulties. When we find ourselves in the midst of sorrow and difficulty, there are some things we can learn, but that is a far different thing than saying God brings evil upon us in order to teach us a lesson. What I do want to address is my experience that there are some advantages for us when we face difficulty and disadvantage. Particularly in the book of Psalms, we hear of the difficulties of life and the importance of facing hardship with honesty. Sensitivity to sorrow belongs at the very heart of biblical religion. It is interesting how often in our worship we focus on psalms of celebration and order, the kinds of psalms proclaiming God's in his heaven and all's right with the world. But the truth is, most of the psalms are not songs of celebration. They are not saying everything is exactly as God intended it to be. Rather, the largest number of psalms are psalms of lament, psalms of sorrow, psalms of difficulty. It is just that kind of honesty that needs to become more a part of our faith, not less. It is more religious to face our doubts, difficulties, sickness, and failures head on. Taking our anxieties straight to God rather than trying to picture our faith as saying, if you're truly faithful, nothing bad ever happens to you. What a strange theology for people who worship a man who died on a cross. Sorrow is at the very heart of our faith. In facing difficulty directly and honestly, we will find some important lessons, perhaps of more value than we might discover if we insist that religious people should always be happy and wear a smile on their face. So let us consider the advantages of disadvantage. Let's also consider, if there's another mic on in the room, let's turn it off. Okay, well, they will work on this. First, it seems to me, one very clear lesson is that weakness. Well, now I've become unplugged. Okay. First, it seems to me that one very clear lesson is that weakness teaches us that we are part of a very fragile human family. Life is defined by our limits. Life is defined by finitude. When we confront the created order, we find ourselves living in a world with metaphysical limitations. There is no way we can have water that will quench our thirst that won't at the same time have the capacity to drown us. There's no way we can have fire that will warm us and won't have the ability to scorch our flesh. There's no way we can have minds attuned to the intricacies of human relationships and not also have minds that are incapable of insanity or misunderstanding. That's the nature of life. The question is not so much saying when we meet difficulties, oh, why me? But understanding, why not me? I'm a part of this entire finite, fragile structure. That's the nature of life. Often we have an idea that as persons of faith, a protective shield has been built around us and nothing evil is ever going to happen to us. You know that's not true. Very good people suffer. Sometimes they suffer because they are very good people. There is not a biblical promise that difficulty will never come to the faithful. There is simply the assurance that even in trouble, you will not be left alone. You will not be abandoned. When we meet those moments at the edges of life, we come to understand what it means to be a fragile human being. What we mean when we say life is fragile is related to the meaning of love. We usually love those things most dearly that are most fragile. Life will inevitably bring sadness, but as it does, it also has the ability to bring meaning as well. I remember about 25, almost 30 years ago, doctors performing several tests attempted to discover the source of neurological problems I was facing. They were looking for brain tumors, pretty serious stuff. Suddenly, when as a young adult you're facing the problems of a life-threatening disease, you begin to realize how fragile life really is. What interests me most in looking back at those events is remembering what I was focusing on. I was very centered in my thinking, as I'm sure others would be, on those things that are most personally most important, that are most fragile. As I was going through that series of medical tests, trying to determine if I had a brain tumor, which turned out not to be the case at all, my main fear had to do with my two daughters, who were quite young at the time. What concerned me most in that situation was being able to live long enough to teach them to ride a bicycle. Life is fragile, and its fragility reminds us that we love those things that we're most fearful of losing. We need to understand the precious nature of life, and that can lead us to care more deeply. In teaching us that life is fragile, weakness leads us to focus on those things that are most precious to us. Another lesson of facing a disadvantage is that weakness saves us from self-reliance. I have fond memories as a child, and here I'll be speaking as a Southerner to you Yankees. Fond memories of a child, of round trips we would take every summer as our family would drive to the mountains of North Carolina. On that trip, we would always see a number of signs along the roadsides, and they were stupid, and we would laugh at them. Prepare to meet thy God, and get right with God, or Jesus is coming soon. Often those crude signs would be painted on the faces of cliffs hundreds of feet above a deep ravine, and you'd wonder who would risk life and limb in order to paint high on a rock, Jesus saves. We would laugh at those crazy signs, how silly and unsophisticated they were. In his work, The Hungering Dark, Frederick Buechner talks about those same embarrassing messages along some of those same roadsides proclaiming Jesus saves. And he comments, what really bothers us about those road signs was that they were delivered an inescapable message to self-sufficient Americans. You will never make it. You have not and you will not, at least not without help, he wrote. And what could be more presumptuous, more absurd, more pathetic than for some poor fool with a cut-rate brush and a bucket of white paint to claim that the one to give you that help is Jesus. Point is, we are in fact in need of help. Perhaps there is something we need to depend on other than ourselves. It's interesting to look at the discussion in the New Testament of the unforgivable sin. It seems to me the unpardonable sin refers to our refusal to admit our need. The one thing God cannot work with is a person who refuses to admit they need God, that they need to depend on another. In Gary Will's book of several years ago, Certain Trumpets, the author looked at outstanding examples of leadership in various areas of human endeavor. When he looked to religion, his example of good religious leadership was Pope John the 23rd, the one who energized a modern-day Reformation, bringing the winds of change to the Roman Catholic Church. Wills reported the secret of religious leadership for the good Pope was found not in independent strength, but on learning to lean on another. He says Pope John often meditated on the risen Jesus' words to Peter, as you would expect, in the Gospel of John. When you were young, you fastened your belt about you and walked where you chose. But when you are old, you will stretch out your arms, and a stranger will bind you fast and carry you where you have no wish to go. John the 23rd identified with that act of being led and supported by another as the secret of mature religious leadership. We need to learn to lean on another. Disadvantages can lead us to see the failure of self-reliance, recognizing that there are some things we cannot and some things we should not face on our own. It's the most difficult thing, it seems to me, for Americans or for citizens of the United States to grasp with our inbred, rugged individuality. What we can learn from facing disability is to recognize the need to learn to lean on others. Weakness also helps to place life in proper perspective, looking at the possibility of death, and I'm not just talking about ultimate death, but for those of disability, sometimes it's dying by inches. Looking at the possibility of death, for example, really simplifies life. In facing death, you come to realize what is really important. I recall as a seminary student, my very first experience of ministering to a person on their deathbed. It was with anxiety that I went to visit the bedside of old Mr. Emmett, a saintly fellow who had become a very dear friend. I was worried and distraught, but he was very calm. And Mr. Emmett began to minister to me by saying, Tom, don't you understand? Whatever happens to me, I'm going to be all right. He'd come to grips with death. The truth is, my anxiety that day was in facing my own death, not his. One of the best examples of how facing our weakness can put our life in proper perspective came from Paul Tillich, the Protestant theologian, in his marvelous sermon entitled Shaking of the Foundations. He talked about the events of World War II and how they shook the world to its foundations, and how also they shook the soldiers to their foundations, making the soldiers appear much like the prophets we first met in the Hebrew Bible. Here's how he put it. All the foundations of personal, natural, and cultural life have been shaken. As long as there's been a human history, that's what has happened. But in our period, it's happened on a larger scale than ever before. Not one foundation of life in our civilization remains unshaken. There are soldiers who have become prophets. And their message is not very different from the message of that ancient Hebrew prophet. It's the message of the shaking of the foundations, and not those of their enemies, but rather those foundations of their own country. How could the prophets speak as they did? How could they paint those terrible pictures of doom and destruction without cynicism and despair? It was because beyond the sphere of destruction, they saw the sphere of salvation. Because in the doom of the temporal, they saw the manifestation of the eternal. Because they were certain they belonged within two spheres, the changeable and the unchangeable. Disadvantage will shake the very foundations of life. And having been shaken, when the veil is torn away, we understand those things of eternal value as never before. Another lesson of disadvantage. Suffering and death can teach us to take life and dying seriously. Martin Heidegger argued correctly that the very key to understanding life is coming to grips with the inescapable fact of facing death. Death, he wrote, when faced authentically, can become the very best route to understanding what life is all about. As we look at our American and United States culture, I think we would be the very best example of what Heidegger talked about in terms of inauthentic ways of facing death. The last thing we want to do, what makes us most uncomfortable, is to look at the limits of life and the possibility of death and dying. Much of our culture is based upon the idea of camouflaging the most universal event of humankind. We're all in the process of dying. It's interesting how much of our life is an attempt to evade that fact. There are a lot of inauthentic ways to face death. Refusing to admit it's going to happen, refusing to prepare for it, refusing to deal with it. For Heidegger, it would also be inauthentic to rush suicidally toward death. It was not his idea to brood constantly about death and think only about dying things. The authentic way of facing death is to understand it's always a possibility and to be prepared to die. There are several things we all ought to do for ourselves and particularly for others as we prepare for death. Some of the best times I've spent with dying parishioners involved planning their funeral services with them while they were still living, focusing on how they wanted to be remembered. Preparing authentically for death means to prepare for that eventuality. We all need to do that. In facing the last challenges of our life, how do we deal with death? Heidegger suggested that death is both unique and uttermost possibility of life. It's the uttermost possibility because behind everything we face in this life lurks death. By that he meant there's nothing you're going to touch that won't participate in dying. Then he said that death is the unique possibility of life. By that he meant as you look at all the possibilities of life, death is the only possibility that once it is realized, everything else disappears. It's a unique possibility. It's the most important possibility we need to consider. Facing death authentically can teach us to take life seriously. Ray Mullaney was a dear friend when we were living in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I was pastoring there. Though a layman, he was this pastor's pastor. He pulled me aside one evening in the church parking lot and talked about how his cancer had returned, how he was going to die, and it was going to be very soon. Then he began to quote poetry like his mother would about facing death with faith. I'll never forget the final conversation with Ray a few months after that conversation in the parking lot. Very late one night, his wife called me to come over to the house. Ray was at home being cared for by hospice. One of his sons was at the foot of his bed, his wife Martha on the other side of the bed from me. As part of our regular lunchtime conversations, Ray had asked months before about a passage in the Old Testament, wondering, just what does God look like? So now in this last conversation, he very haltingly asked the question because the morphine cocktail had begun to take its effect. And he said, what does God look like now for me? Well, I responded as best I could as his pastor and as his friend. Said, right now God looks like a man dying on a cross, and that cross is in the very heart of God. In a little while I went on to say, and in the face of death, God also looks like the risen Lord. But then, as usual, Ray had the best word, and in this case, one of his very last words, as he turned and said to me very slowly, Tom, God told us what God looks like. God looks like love. What a marvelous thing to have on your lips as you're facing death. A recognition that death is coming, but you face it knowing the love of God who holds all of life and death in divine hand. Weakness also saves us from isolation. One thing you know you have in common with everyone else in life is our suffering, our hurt, our pain. Henry Nouwen came to be known to many in Christian circles through his book, The Wounded Healer, and what a marvelous image that is. We're not only called to be healers in our work, but we come as Christians to be healers only as we come to grips with our own woundedness. We best minister to one another out of our hurt, not out of our strength, out of our pain, not out of our carelessness about others' hurt. We best minister to one another out of our hurt, not about seeing ourselves as above pain. What a crucial image that is that Nouwen gives us in his image of the Messiah, a wounded healer, sitting among the sick and wounded, ready to help, coming to grips with our own wounds, saves us from isolation and helps us to understand that the task of faith is not to save us from being wounded, but to minister even in the midst of our woundedness. A final thing that has been crucially important for me in facing finitude, sorrow, and illness is to see how disadvantage can focus our use of time. Walter Kaufmann, certainly no Christian theologian, edited a marvelous book, Existentialism, Religion, and Death, where he brought together several essays on facing death. Kaufmann, in reading through his book, I was amazed by the importance of what he had to say. He wrote an essay in light of his own experience of facing terminal illness. And in that essay, he had a passage that when I read it first saying, no, that can't be right. And I went back and read it again, and he said, the life I want is a life that could not endure in eternity. There is no other life I should prefer, neither should I like not to die. Think about that. I would not want a life in which I would not die. Kaufmann talked about how facing death can focus our use of time. It's amazing, isn't it, how much time we waste? How we continue to put things off. Oh, I'll deal with that someday. I'll get around to that sometime. Or I'll patch that relationship up later. Or I can take care of that at another time. One advantage of looking at death is realizing we have a limited amount of time. It makes a difference how we live if we understand we're called to use our time wisely. Kaufmann, I think, taught us well when he said, I would not want to live a life in which I would not die. We are called to live life as if it were not forever, to use it wisely here on earth. Weakness teaches us that life is fragile. It saves us from self-reliance. It places life in proper perspective. It teaches us to take death and life seriously. It saves us from isolation, and it focuses our time. All of this leaves us confronted with some choices. One is the choice of faith or unbelief. It seems to me the most profound argument for unbelief comes from the issues of evil and suffering. How can there be a good God when there's so much pain in life? Frank Tupper, a professor at Wake Forest University Divinity School, reflected on that issue and wrote a book of theology in light of his wife's illness and death. He talked about how the importance of Jesus Christ for him is not that he removes us from suffering, but that with Jesus Christ we learn how to endure and deal with suffering. Speaking from his Christian perspective, he writes, with Christ I can believe. Listen how Frank Tupper puts this in his book, A Scandalous Providence. Of course, I cannot speak for anyone else, only for me. But this I know, without the story of Jesus, I would not believe in God. Or more probably, God simply wouldn't matter. The story of Jesus enables me to envision God as one who genuinely cares for each and for all of us. In Jesus, God confronts the darkness face to face, incarnate for our sake. Jesus is the light of the gentle face of God. And the story of Jesus says that God laughs with us in our joys and weeps with us in our sorrows. God strengthens us in our helplessness. God stands with us in the uncertainty of our unbelieving. And God waits for us in our yearning to belong. Ultimately, it is the lonely companionship of Jesus, the suffering of his passion, that makes my painful journey a sometime story of faith. Faith or unbelief. It may well be that issues of suffering can be the very thing that brings us to the deepest understanding of faith. A second choice, anger or creative response. A few years ago, I was in the Czech Republic. I'd always heard about the city of Lidice, not a huge town, but a significant village, where sabotage and guerrilla fighting had occurred during World War II. The Nazis came in. They wanted to teach the citizens of Lidice a lesson. So they killed every man and almost all of the older male children. They demolished the town, completely leveled it. There's not a wall left standing. Lidice was almost erased from the face of the globe. You can go back to Lidice today, and there the crumbled remains of the town have been preserved, kept as a memory to past atrocity. My favorite place on the globe is the city of Coventry, England, and the new cathedral that has gone up in that city. It's one of the most beautiful buildings in all of Christendom. Coventry was bombed and senselessly destroyed in large part during World War II. The old cathedral was burned and ruined, but if you go back there to the side of the old cathedral, there's now an open-air chapel. They've taken two of the charred roof beams and formed a large cross, hung it in front of what is now an outdoor chapel, and have emblazoned new words on the altar, and there below the charred embers are written the words, Father, forgive. Across the street is one of the best expressions of Christian art and architecture you will ever see. Not stained glass windows, but etched glass windows, and a very vibrant and active church. Two cities, Lidice and Coventry, both the victims of senseless warfare. But one is an example of faith, the other an example of destruction. We have some choices to make as we face difficulty, faith or unbelief. And we have choices to make, anger or creative response. I would hope for each one of us, as we face our disadvantages, we might learn of some disadvantages as well.